So as all these people are moving towards these urban areas, again, about 2/3 of immigrants are going to move into these places like New York, Chicago, Boston, etc. And again, they're moving towards these places for job opportunities. And a lot of the times, these people of the same ethnic backgrounds are all going to move together. I mentioned this earlier, that we can see this as far as people kind of migrating to the same areas. And these are called enclaves. And if we look here at the map, what this does a really good job of kind of showing is where a lot of ethnic groups kind of mesh or kind of move towards together and create kind of this ethnic group or this little community for themselves. So just here, this is a example of New York City. You can see here on the map that it's on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. So it's right on the edge of where Brooklyn and Manhattan meet. And here against the East River, that you have different groups of people from their different cultures, whether it be from the Russian cultures or from the Jewish cultures or from Hungarian, Romanian, and these different enclaves kind of all move together. And they kind of create their own little subsidiary cultures within the greater scheme of the American city or of New York City. And these enclaves are a place for them to kind of live almost a home away from home, in the sense that they can kind of adapt and kind of slowly assimilate, but also keep a lot of their same cultural legacies, I guess, if we want to use that word, together. And they can speak their language, they can eat their food, they can kind of feel like they're still in their own homeland while still being here in the United States. So again, as these people are coming over to the New World or to the United States, a lot of these immigrants are taking up industrial jobs because that just happens to be the jobs that are available, and they're in these major cities where, if you're in a place like Chicago, that's really kind of what's available to you, is working in a factory. And as these industries are rapidly growing, they need cheap laborers. So that's why, as a business, you really like immigration, because it allows for there to be a thing about supply and demand, like any sort of product in economics, is that when you have a larger supply of something, price goes down. And then when your demand goes down, your price goes down as well. So because there is just so many more workers, you're able to pay them less, which means higher profits for the companies. And that's where you get a lot of, we talked already about a lot of the resounding resentment towards the immigrants coming in, from those who are seen as natives, because they see it as, well, I'm getting paid less because more and more workers are coming in. That's why a lot of these jobs should be going, in their view, should be going to those of the Americans. A lot of these immigrants were unskilled. We mentioned that earlier. Same thing as far as the the Americans who are moving from the rural areas to the urban areas, same thing, or many of them are unskilled, in the fact that they really only have low skill or low paying job backgrounds, because most of them have been farmers or have been peasants their entire lives, depending on where they're coming from. So many of them, again, whether they're being immigrants or Americans, these lower level workers are really willing to take whatever kind of jobs they can get. So we're going to use this cartoon here in class, and we're going to kind of diagnose it a little bit deeper. But I do like the question here that's posed as far as what problems did the workers face in the Gilded Age, and we're going to take a look at kind of what were some of the issues and some of the things that we talk about as far as the long hours or the terrible conditions and so forth. But here we're going to focus on what are the responses to these problems. And a lot of the workers will eventually form what's called labor unions. And the purpose of these labor unions is to collectively bargain for better working conditions. So in response to these low wages, these longer hours, these terrible conditions, a lot of workers are going to kind of join together to try to basically fight for their better conditions, or these better working areas for them to succeed and to thrive, so they're not so dangerous and they're getting paid or being compensated better for their jobs. So one of the first labor unions here we're going to take a look at, and one of the most influential from this Gilded Age time period, is the Knights of Labor. Make sure that you know the Knights of Labor. I can almost guarantee that there's going to be at least one question on the AP final exam about the Knights of Labor. It just seems like that's always a major topic to include from the Gilded Age. Well, one of the things about the Knights of Labor, I guess, that would be more unique to the other labor unions, is they're kind of open to all workers, regardless of your skill level, your immigration status, your race, your gender. Whoever you are can be somebody who's part of the Knights of Labor. And it's kind of the Knights of Labor are led by Terence Powderly, and here's some of the things what they're looking for. A lot of this we can see that does hold true, that we still kind of have today, as far as the 8-hour workday, workers cooperative. So being able to not only work together, but also having kind of a say in management, worker-owned factories, abolition of child and prison labor, increased circulation of greenbacks. And greenbacks referring to that of the money supply, so paper money rather than opposed to gold and silver, but also the idea of just being paid more and being compensated more. Also the idea of equal pay for men and women for their work, equal pay for equal work, and having safer hours, having a contract or a prohibition of contract with foreign labor, so hiring that of people who are in the country who are working rather than going outside the country to find workers, similar to what sometimes businesses do today, where they might open up a plant, let's say in Mexico or in China or other places around the world where they can find cheaper labor. So another one of the largest or most successful labor unions that is going to be from this time period in the Gilded Age is going to be the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor, and this is going to be led by Samuel Gompers, and he's a very important person to know as well. Now, unlike the Knights of Labor, who included any workers, the AFL was only used for skilled workers, so people who had crafts jobs, people who maybe would be artisans or blacksmiths, or anybody who had a skilled level job. So not low-level factory workers, not low-level farmers, but people who actually had a skilled job. Think of it kind of like what we would think of as today, somebody who has a degree for a job. But they would use things like collective bargaining to gain better pay, shorter hours, better working conditions for its union members, and from this they would work kind of hand in hand with that of the management teams to try to make working conditions better for workers. Most workers were ineligible to join because, again, most workers are unskilled. So many more workers will work for Knights of Labor, while the AFL is more for the higher class workers, kind of the more middle class, the upper class management levels, while the unskilled are more for the Knights of Labor. And just statistically, that we look at by the end of the Gilded Age, only about 4% of American workers were unionized. So by looking at this political cartoon, what it's really kind of trying to get at is showing here the Knights of, or the business owners of that would be, who have these monopolies, whether it be from the railroad lines or from other factories, really kind of have an upper edge and a lot larger say than that of certain labor unions. And that's not always held true, as as we talked about with the AFL, they will work for better conditions and things are getting better over time, but definitely the majority of workers will not join labor unions, either from lack of skill and they're not able to join these unions, or from just choice from not joining them. So one of the most effective tactics, or one of the better tactics that unions typically tend to use, and I think a lot of us would know this, would be to strike. And basically a strike is designed to stop production or to force management to accept union demands. So if you have a group of workers who have certain demands that they want to be kept or met, and the bosses are not meeting those, well, then you just stop working, because when you stop working, what's going to happen is that you're going to just not be able to, the factory's not going to run, the business will lose money, and eventually they will cave. This is sometimes it's successful, but sometimes it's not. And some of the more famous ones here we're going to look at, like the Pullman strike in Chicago or the Homestead strike in Homestead. We're going to see kind of what happens with these different strikes and if they're successful or not. So a lot of times what business leaders would do when this would not be successful would be that business leaders resisted strikes by either hiring replacement workers. So if, let's say, you're striking because you want to make $1 an hour instead of 50 cents an hour, well, I'll just go find somebody who will work for 50 cents an hour. And because you have a huge influx of immigrants coming into the system or into the country, you have a larger supply of workers. You're usually able to find somebody to do this. And this is also one of the reasons why so many people do not join the union, because they don't want to have to be forced to strike when the union strikes. They'll also use secret police, or not secret police, but private police or security, privately owned security from the businesses, to kind of break up strikes and to try to get them off property and to try to make sure it does not become violent. So during the Gilded Age here in Chicago, one of the more infamous strikes is going to be the Haymarket strike, and I would make sure that I know this one, is where you have workers who are demanding 8-hour days. Eventually violence is going to break out, and public opinion turns against the unions, as viewing them as violent and un-American. So we see again kind of where you have less and less people who want to join the union because they don't want to be labeled as this. They don't want this negative connotation, and they want the chance to work. They would rather work the 10, 12, 14-hour day than not be able to work at all, or be replaced by somebody who will do their job. Another strike in Homestead is going to be another huge one, or more kind of an infamous one, where violence does erupt at a steel plant that was owned by Carnegie, and essentially federal troops had to be brought in to kind of quell the violence. And what essentially happens is that replacement workers are brought in to work for the lower conditions that were originally set in place. There's also going to be the Pullman strike with the railroad lines workers in Chicago, or in Illinois, I'm sorry, and by what they're striking for is by having their wages cut. It gets so bad and so violent that eventually President Cleveland has to send in the army to end the strike. Okay, so this is another example where you see that the strikers, or the unions, are getting so violent to the point where it has to be quelled by even the army. And dozens will die. Strikers are going to resist not only just in Chicago but also in 27 states. It's kind of seen as a nationwide march, I guess, or a nationwide strike, if you want to call it that. But it's going to be led by the Pullman Company here, that's kind of focused more in Chicago.